This hearing will come to order. This hearing titled Made by Maduro, the Humanitarian Crisis in Venezuela and U.S. Policy Responses, will focus on the political, economic, and human rights crisis in Venezuela and ways for the international community to support the Venezuelan people. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, strenuous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. I will now make an opening statement and then turn it over to the ranking member for his opening statement. Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today for such a timely and important topic. This is our first subcommittee hearing of the 116th Congress, and I just want to say that I am looking forward to working with every member of this committee, including Ranking Member Rooney and Vice Chair Meeks, to bring much-needed attention to the Western Hemisphere. Today, the Venezuelan people are suffering under a humanitarian crisis caused by authoritarian leader Nicolás Maduro. Since Maduro came to power in 2013, he has consistently repressed human rights. Under his command, security forces have arbitrarily detained and abused thousands of protesters, committed acts of torture and forced disappearances, and carried out hundreds of brutal killings, all with the single goal of eliminating any and all opposition. Just yesterday, we saw another assault on democracy when Maduro detained American journalist Jorge Ramos for hours just because he didn't like the questions he was being asked. Maduro has caused an economic collapse that has left nearly 90% of Venezuelans in poverty and forced over 3 million Venezuelans to leave their country. While average Venezuelans suffer from crippling inflation and shortages of food and medicine, Maduro and his cronies have enriched themselves through drug trafficking and money laundering. Maduro's illegitimate re-election last year cemented his position as a dictator. If there was any doubt, one just needs to examine this weekend's event when Maduro thugs burned tons of boxes of food and medicine. He'd rather see his people starve and suffer than face the truth. It is clear from the massive demonstrations that have been taking place that Venezuelans have had enough. They are demanding an end to Maduro's reign of terror. At this pivotal moment, the United States must stand by the Venezuelan people and on the side of democracy. I have joined many of my colleagues in recognizing the interim president, Juan Guaidó, and calling for swift elections that are free, fair, and transparent. I believe the U.S. must work closely with allies in Latin America and Europe to help the Venezuelan people reclaim their fundamental rights and restore democracy. And we must take note of the regimes that are enabling Maduro. Cuba continues to provide intelligence support to Maduro to prevent military officials from defecting to the side of democracy. And Russia and Turkey are providing financial lifelines to keep Maduro afloat. The international community should be unified and calling for an immediate peaceful transition that swiftly leads to free and fair elections, in which every political party is allowed to participate and fully competitive conditions are guaranteed by international observers. To achieve that goal, we must apply maximum diplomatic and economic pressure on Maduro and do all we can to support the Venezuelan people. That is why I have joined my colleagues in working to hold Maduro's accountable while providing aid to address the humanitarian crisis. I have joined Congressman Soto in calling for the U.S. to grant temporary protected status to Venezuelans fleeing this crisis. And I co-sponsor legislation proposed by Congresswoman Moscasel Powell, which would authorize the president to direct $150 million in humanitarian assistance to the people of Venezuela. As we ramp up the pressure on Maduro, we need to be thinking also about the day after he's gone and how we can support the Venezuelan people to rebuild not just their democracy, but their economy. I look forward to hearing from the experts with us today about what further steps the U.S. government can take in close coordination with allies to help the Venezuelan people reclaim their democracy. Thank you, and I now turn to the ranking member for his opening statement. Congressman Yoho.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it, and I'm going to read Ambassador Rooney's opening statement. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The current humanitarian and economic plaguing Venezuela is unprecedented in our hemisphere. The socialist policies, corruption, and economic mismanagement by the Maduro regime have destroyed what was once the most prosperous country in Latin America, created one of the greatest exoduses of people, wealth, and talent in recent historical memories. Up to 3 million people have fled Venezuela. We said this on a news conference yesterday. You know, if it's doing so well, the Maduro regime is doing so well, why would 3 million people of your own country want to leave? Destabilizing the region and most severely impacting our strong ally, Colombia, and all of South America. Of course, an illegitimate dictator like Maduro refuses to accept responsibility for the current crisis, blaming the United States will never explain hyperinflation exceeding 2 million%, I read the other day. I don't know how that's possible. Or an average Venezuela losing over 20 pounds in body weight due to malnutrition. Instead, Maduro ignores the suffering of the Venezuelan people and continues to block humanitarian aid from entering his country. I commend the Trump administration for leading the effort to bring humanitarian assistance to the Venezuelan people in response to interim President Guaido's request. I also applaud Colombian President Duque, who we met with last week, and Brazilian President Bolsonaro for their support and strong commitment to democracy and freedom for the Venezuelan people. The Maduro regime also refuses to listen to the request of the Venezuelan people and has violently cracked down on peaceful dissent and committed serious human rights violation and abuses, including torture and death. Just this past weekend, security forces are believed to have killed at least 25 people and injured more than 285 because they dared to protest. He has usurped the power of the democratically elected National Assembly and destroyed Venezuela's democratic institutions while ignoring condemnation from the international community. The Maduro regime is not one of elected officials chosen by the Venezuelan people, but criminals who run a mafia-like enterprise to enrich themselves at the expense of ordinary Venezuelans. Just last week we had a meeting where we found out that over $11 billion was pilfered off of the petroleum companies that have enriched the upper echelons of the Maduro regime at the expense of the Venezuelan people. The mafia state has not risen to power on its own. U.S. adversaries, and keep in mind, it goes back to what our parents taught us as kids. You become who you hang around with. U.S. adversaries like Russia, Cuba, China, Iran, and Morales of Bolivia support the Maduro regime. That should tell you right there they're on the wrong side. Cuban officials are embedded in the Venezuelan military to the point to where Maduro relies on the security forces of the Cuban regime for support because he can't trust his own people. Russia and Iran see Venezuela as a disruptive thorn in the side of the United States, and China exploits a corrupt regime for discounted oil and access to resources. This is the real foreign interference we should be talking about. The illegitimate Maduro regime also has ties to drug trafficking and other illicit activities, and the Venezuelan people are the first victims of this corruption and cronyism. Over the last month, the Venezuelan people have stood up to the Maduro regime and demanded the return of Venezuela to the prosperous, free nation it once was. Interim President Juan Guaido has certified a united movement against the Maduro regime and has gained the recognition of over 50 countries. Maduro wants to blame the U.S. for this, but this is 50 international countries that have stood up to this. Again, I commend the Trump administration's strong support for Guaido and the Venezuelan people and support the calls for free and fair elections in Venezuela as soon as conditions allow for them. And I strongly support the continuation of sanctions against the Maduro regime and the use of all economic tools at our disposal to hold them accountable for the crimes. There is much work to be done for Venezuela to regain its freedom. and freedom they will regain, because the Venezuelan people grew up in this generation of liberties and freedoms, and he's trying to snatch that away from them. They will not tolerate that, and that on itself is enough to change that regime. I'm encouraged by the efforts of the administration and Special Representative Elliott Abrams to achieve these goals in coordination with our regional allies, and further, hope my Democrat and Republican colleagues here in Congress will work together to present a united front against the Maduro regime that will encourage other nations to be on the right side of history. I look forward to the hearing, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Yoho. We're going to open it up for 1-minute remarks by the members. Vice Chair Meeks, you have a...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'm going to submit my full statement for the record. I'll summarize it real quickly in this 1 minute. You know, clearly to see what's happening to the people of Venezuela is heartbreaking to witness. When you talk about the scenario and human lives being lost in many instances and people going hungry, no one wants to stand by and see such tragedies. But I do believe that it is important that the Lima groups and some of our allies in the region take the lead on this. It is just too much, I think, that it seems as though with our past history in the region in Central and South America and some of the bellicose talks that's going on about military threats, that hurts getting things done. I appreciate the fact that I see how with not a lot of bellicose, that Peru and Colombia and Brazil, those border states, have been dealing with this. And I look forward to questioning the witnesses and going and pursuing this a little bit further, but I submit my full statement for the record.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Yoho, 1-minute remark. 1 minute.
You know, we look at this, and we met with the interim ambassador that has been placed in that position that we recognize. And what I see is this is just not about Venezuela. This is about the other nations that we talked about: Cuba, China, Russia, Iran, Bolivia. These are all anti-Western democracies, and the Rubicon is Venezuela. If the Maduro regime fails, so does Cuba, because they have invested so much over the course of the years, and same with Russia. This is something that we've got over 70 million displaced refugees around the world because of conflict. We've got the potential of having millions more that we have never seen in this country coming through our southern border, and this is something that we need to have a peaceful resolution as soon as possible, and I look forward to this hearing.
Thank you. Congressman Espaillat.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Although I have, in the past, been outspoken against any form of military intervention by our nation, we cannot continue to be the policemen of the world. I am very distressed to see what is occurring in Venezuela. Particularly yesterday, we saw how Jorge Ramos and his Univision crew were detained for 2 hours when he showed Maduro a film of the children, Venezuelan children, eating off a garbage truck. Yeah. That's been protested by the entire world, including Mexico, who has been somewhat ambivalent about what's happening in Venezuela. They protested this, and just today, Jorge Ramos and his crew were deported forcefully moved from Venezuela. That is, Mr. Chairman, troubling, because the eyes of the world must be on what's happening there. The whole world must be watching what's happening there. We cannot be blindfolded to that, and that's an egregious act against humanity.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Vargas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for holding this hearing. I have to say that I'm very distressed at what's happening in Venezuela. Venezuela has been a very proud country. In fact, it has some of the largest oil reserves in the world. It's been a country that's historically been very wealthy in Latin America and on the move. And to see what's happened to it under Maduro is tragic. It's become a failed state. And also to reiterate what happened to Jorge Ramos, a lot of us see Jorge Ramos as the Walter Cronkite of Spanish news. someone that we always trust. He's very straightforward in what he says. And to see what happened to him and his crew, how they were manhandled and mishandled and mistreated, it was really tragic, because we need to see with the eyes, I think, of a very honest news person like himself what's going on there. So again, I'm very happy that we're having this hearing today, and I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and the ranking member.
Thank you, Congressman. Let me introduce first Ms. Marcela Escobar, Senior Fellow in the Center for Universal Education at Brookings, where she is leading the Workforce of the Future initiative. She spent the last year of President Obama's administration as an assistant administrator of the U.S. Agency for International Development's Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean, focusing its initiatives on poverty, inequality, citizen security, and governance. Since 2007, the Honorable Ms. Escobar, did I say that right? Okay. Served as an executive director of the Center for International Development at Harvard University. She has also worked as head of the Americas region at the OTF Group, where she advised governments on poverty eradication through enterprise. We welcome you again. Thank you. We will then hear from Mr. Santiago Canton, who currently serves as Secretary of Human Rights for the province of Buenos Aires. In 2017, he was appointed by the Organization of the American States Secretary General Luis Almagro as one of 3 experts to join an independent panel to examine the human rights situation in Venezuela. Mr. Canton was formerly director of RFK Partners for Human Rights at the Robert F. Kennedy Center for Justice and Human Rights. Before joining the RFK Center, Mr. Canton was the Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights for 11 years, after serving as the first Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression in the Inter-American System. He also served as Director for Latin America and the Caribbean for the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs as a political assistant to former United States President Jimmy Carter. Welcome. Finally, we will hear from Moises Rendon, Associate Director and Associate Fellow of the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Americas Program. His research focused on Latin American states in transition, trade and investment, governance and transparency, and U.S. foreign policy towards Latin America, with particular emphasis on Venezuela. He is a native Venezuelan. Thank you all for being here. I would, now we would go to questions.
No,
testimony, excuse me. Ms. Kovari, you have 5 minutes?
Thank you, Chairman Cires and members of this committee for calling this hearing and for the opportunity to testify today. I'll be summarizing my views and ask that my full testimony be placed in the record. Venezuela presents a complex situation for a humanitarian response, where there is a legitimate, widely recognized, and democratically elected entity in the National Assembly, and now interim President Juan Guaido. However, he does not, as of now, have the command of the military forces or the government bureaucracy. So while the official request of humanitarian aid from the National Assembly has started to be answered by the international community, it is a contested environment where the delivery of aid is being explicitly blocked by Nicolás Maduro and the military. So the situation calls for a 2-tiered response. One is what to do during this impasse, and 2, what to do in case of a much-needed democratic transition. Alleviating the human suffering and the refugee crisis looks different under these 2 scenarios. In the status quo, we need to deliver aid in a politically neutral way to those that need it the most. This may involve engaging the UN, funding existing local and multinational NGOs on the ground, and using a variety of delivery channels, from cash transfers to airdrops of supplies, as the need is and will be massive, both inside Venezuela and the neighboring countries affected by the refugee crisis. Now, let's be clear that while important and necessary given the extent of the humanitarian crisis, this approach is palliative. In the case of a democratic transition, Venezuela can engage in the profound reforms that are needed: stabilizing the currency, rebooting the private provision of goods, massive cash transfers to alleviate acute shortages, and investing in public services, from the replenishment of hospitals to citizen security. This transition will involve significant aid, and likely the largest IMF package in its history. So what is the situation? Venezuela has seen one of the most dramatic economic contractions in human history. Inflation has surpassed 1,000,000% in the last year. If Venezuelans used to buy a carton of milk with $1 in January, in December it cost them $10,000. Obviously, salaries have not kept up. GDP has contracted over 50% in the last 5 years, the largest contraction in the world last year. It has over $150 billion in debt, while oil output, which is 95% of exports, has gone down 64% in the last 20 years due to mismanagement and corruption. Poverty has gone from 48% to 91% in the last 4 years. Venezuela is one of the most violent countries in the world. Parts of Venezuela have become lawless refuge for the FARC, the ELN, and non-state actors to engage in narco-trafficking, illegal mining, and contraband of gasoline. There are shortages of almost every basic medication. The Ministry of Health reported on a 100-fold increase in neonatal deaths. We've seen the rise of diseases previously eradicated, from malaria, where we've seen over 500,000 cases, as well as Zika, polio, diphtheria, measles. Shortages of vaccines means that this problem is likely to aggravate and spread given the refugee crisis, which has reached 3.4 million Venezuelans which have left their country, an average of 5,000 Venezuelans who cross the border every day. Diseases do not respect borders and pose a regional security threat. So to conclude, our unwavering support of the Venezuelan people is critical in this moment. There are two distinct strategies at play. One involves exerting maximum economic and political pressure on the regime that increases the chances of a bloodless transition. The second is a humanitarian response, which is distinct from the political and diplomatic strategy, should be neutral and target the most vulnerable. We should also be prepared to commit the resources that are commensurate with the need, which will be multiples of the current commitments. In both of these fronts, we need to maintain a multilateral approach. We are stronger and wiser when we work with others. And what makes this moment remarkable is the global support coalescing behind the new government and the humanitarian response. The Grupo de Lima, the OAS, most of the European Union make up the over 50 countries recognizing Guaidó and pressing for a democratic transition. It is this coalition, ideally led by the Grupo de Lima and supported by the US, that represents a hope for the Venezuelan people who have suffered too long under a brutal and corrupt regime. I wish to sincerely thank you for calling this hearing on the Venezuelan crisis and for inviting me to testify today.
Thank you, Mr. Canton. Can you please turn your mic on? Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. The Secretary General of the Organization of American States, Luis Almagro, has recently stated, "The regime in Venezuela is responsible for what has become one of the worst humanitarian crises the region has experienced. This crisis is man-made and a direct result of inhuman actions by leaders who do not care about the suffering of their people, allowing their citizens to die of hunger and preventable diseases." In 2018, the UN Food and Agricultural Organization indicated that between 2015 and 2017, 11% of Venezuela's population, 3.7 million people, were undernourished, up from less than 5% between 2008 and 2013. The 2018 National Survey of Hospitals showed that the capacity of the national network of hospitals has been gradually dismantled over the last 5 years. The survey reported 88% of shortages in medicines and 79% of shortages of surgical supplies. Indicators such as the increase of maternal mortality by 60% and infant mortality by 30% from 2014 to 2016, the lack of access to adequate and regular treatment for more than 300,000 patients with chronic diseases, or the outbreak of malaria and diphtheria, all point to a dramatic deterioration of the healthcare system. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the UN observed that women are particularly affected by the health crisis. For instance, the number of maternal deaths rose from 368 in 2012 to 756 in 2016. Last year, as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, I was appointed by the OAS to a panel of 3 independent international experts that after evaluating the information of the humanitarian crisis, concluded that the use of the crisis as an instrument to pressure a segment of the population that is considered as dissidents or that is identified as such constitute multiple violations of fundamental rights, such as the right to life, right to humane treatment, the right to health, and the right to food, making it a crime of persecution for political reasons. The humanitarian crisis has triggered more demonstrations, and the government response to the demonstrations was a policy of systematic violations, which between 2014 and 2018 left thousands of extrajudicial executions, 12,000 arbitrary detentions, 289 cases of torture, 192 cases of rape of persons under state control, and a number of enforced disappearances. The panel of experts found reasonable grounds to believe that these acts against the civilian population of Venezuela constituted crimes against humanity in accordance with Article 7 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, including the crimes of murder, imprisonment, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, persecution, and enforced disappearances. Finally, the case that the panel worked on was sent by 5 countries to the ICC. In 2001, the countries of this hemisphere approved the world's first democratic charter with the goal of defending democracy and human rights. Unfortunately, due to regional politics, the Inter-American Democratic Charter has clearly failed. Mr. Chairman, this is not about politics. This is not about the Latin American left or the Latin American right, populism or fascism. This crisis is about the personal greed, corruption, and organized criminal activity of a mafia that under the banner of nationalism and sovereignty is killing, torturing, persecuting, and detaining its own people. In the year 2000, the Canadian government established a commission to respond to a question of the UN Secretary General Kofi Annan on when the international community must intervene for humanitarian purposes. The Canadian Commission stated that sovereignty entails not only rights, but also the responsibility to protect its people from major violation of human rights. Basically, Mr. Chairman, the principle of non-intervention yields to the international responsibility to protect. In this situation, it means to exercise the responsibility to protect the Venezuelan citizens facing grave human rights violations. And that is where we are now, Mr. Chairman. The international community, not any country unilaterally, should work together, particularly with the countries that form the Lima Group, but also with those who have not joined the Lima Group, to return to the Venezuelans the democracy, the human rights, and the dignity that the group of organized criminals took away from them. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Votes have just been called, so Mr. Rendon, can you do your 5 minutes, and then we'll go in a recess and come back so we can ask you some questions. And thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, distinguished committee members, thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on the crisis in Venezuela. My colleagues already talked about how we got here, including the most important humanitarian and economic indicators, so I will highlight some issues on how the U.S. and the international community can non-violently support Venezuelans to reclaim their democracy from this kleptocratic mafia state. It is important to emphasize that interim President Guaidó did not proclaim himself as president, as has been reported. After January 10th of this year, Maduro lost any legitimacy left to continue in office. The presidential elections held last May were not only unfree and unfair, but also illegally called by the illegitimate Constituent Assembly and organized by an unconstitutionally named National Election Council. This is why more than 50 countries, together with the National Assembly at the Supreme Court in exile, did not recognize the results and now recognize Guaido in lines of Articles 233, 333, and 350 of the Venezuelan Constitution. The next step should be supporting the path that Guaido himself has announced to restore the country's democracy. Stop Maduro's usurpation of power, set up Guaido's interim government such that free and fair elections can be held. The events this past Saturday on February 23rd prove once again that the regime does not care that its own people face starvation and is not willing to leave power, even if it means committing crimes against humanity. The rejection of humanitarian aid, including with the use of force, has been part of Maduro's policy and has been systematically enforced for many years in Venezuela. I'm going to briefly talk about the role of Cuba, China, and Russia. Venezuela has not been a truly sovereign nation for years. The presence of Cuban state actors in different sectors in Venezuela, included in intelligence, military, and property registration offices, violates the Venezuelan Constitution and the international law. China has propped up the Maduro regime, lending nearly $70 billion and possessing large oil fields in the Orinoco Belt, where most of the Venezuelan oil is. Russia's influence in Venezuela, on the other hand, is driven both by economic and foreign policy objectives. I can comment more on this and other issues later, but I want to turn now to where we go from here. I think a military intervention will be catastrophic, Mr. Chairman. Let me be clear. The threat of military involvement is a worthwhile strategy when it exists only as a threat or political language. However, actual boots on the ground or military activity in Venezuela could send the country deeper into chaos. There are FARC members, ELN, gangs, and other paramilitary groups operating in this lawless environment. All of these groups are in peace right now. But as soon as foreign military action comes to Venezuela, they will panic and it will cause even greater security concerns. What's more, the international community does not support a military intervention as of now. We have not yet exhausted all peaceful policy options. Saturday was the first attempt that Humanitarian had attempted to enter to the country. This happened because Juan Guaido has been recognized as the interim president of Venezuela, and together with the National Assembly, urgently request aid. So now that there is a consensus today within the international community that there is no time to waste in Venezuela, the path to limit the suffering of the Venezuelan people and help Venezuelans restore their democracy could be accelerated if the following steps are taken in the short term. 1, provide much-needed humanitarian assistance within Venezuela. Again, Saturday was the first time this was attempted, and the planning and execution needs to be improved moving forward. 2nd, help Guaido's government get off the ground by recovering the Republic's assets from Maduro's control and transferring them to the Guaido and the National Assembly control. 3rd, recognize the new ambassadors appointed by Guaido's interim government and revoking diplomatic visas to those members of the regime and their families, including visas, the other visas, because there are many visas, so revoking the other visas is also very important. 4th, back the National Assembly amnesty law for current and former military officials who decide to help restore the country's democracy and let the humanitarian aid in. 5th, increase pressure on Maduro and his inner circle with individual sanctions, especially by countries who have not imposed sanctions yet. And 6th, prohibit any further international agreements or oil payments to the Maduro regime and transfer those payments to the Maduro's government and the National Assembly. And to finalize, there is no silver bullet to resolve the Venezuelan crisis, Mr. Chairman. However, from a humanitarian and international law perspective, the provision of humanitarian aid needs to be the top priority. The more the U.S. work together with the OEAs and the Lima Group, which, by the way, Venezuela formally joined the Lima Group just yesterday, we will have a better chance to find a peaceful solution. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will recess now. We have 4 votes. We'll be right back. Thank you.
Huh? Yeah. No, I look forward to the questions. I think that's the most fun part. Oh, for the lunch? That's great. And with Brownfield, that's going to be a good discussion. Brownfield is super, super good.
I've seen him on panels.
Oh, really?
Very lively.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
The staffers eat that up.
Yeah. Yeah.
We're going to start, because I know, Mr. Kent, you have to leave, and we'll start with the questioning, and I'll start. You know, I get asked this question all the time, and the question basically is this: are there any other methods for us delivering humanitarian aid that have been used in other places that we could try in Venezuela? Ms. Covardi is there. I mean, obviously this past weekend didn't go well. And I don't know, quite frankly, how to answer that.
No, it's a right question. And I think what we saw this weekend is that Venezuelans are desperate to find ways out of this repressive regime, and they also need to bring food in, and these two goals were conflated this weekend. I think, and thus the aid did not go through. But I think there's a lot that we can try, and it's difficult in a contested environment, but it involves working with international NGOs like the Red Cross, working with local NGOs. There are hundreds of NGOs, thinking creative ways to bring in. Sometimes we need goods, but also cash, because around 20% of the goods are provided by the private sector. It's just that most Venezuelans can't afford them. And I do think there's an opportunity for the UN to step up their game and
they've been pretty quiet about this.
Yes, and I think the UN has played a brokering role in many of these political conflicts, from Yemen to Sudan. And my colleague Jeremy Nongdijk used to work at USAID. He suggests that the UN needs to challenge Maduro's denial of the crisis, and it's Maduro's refusal of the aid that has led the UN with no funding appeal for Venezuela, no humanitarian coordinator appointed within the UN system. OCHA, which coordinates aid, doesn't even include Venezuela. So I think that's an opportunity to find a political mediator in this crisis.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, I would say that many of the questions you have are the same questions that we all have, and we all also do not have an answer. There are no clear answers to many of the problems we are facing in Venezuela. One thing that at least I believe is very important, particularly for the US government, is to follow the Lima Group. There is a dialogue going on there, and if there is any possibility of finding a solution, very likely may come from the Lima Group. And in addition to the Lima Group, I would say, let's not forget about Mexico. Let's not forget about Uruguay. Although those two countries have not recognized Guaido, that doesn't mean that they don't want to collaborate. And you always need, particularly in situations like this one, that is, the situation is very close, you need some interlocutors that can talk to the government. And those are going to be more likely on Mexico and Uruguay than on the Lima Group. So the combination of the work of all the Latin American countries, which Latin America has a history, sometimes good, sometimes bad, but it does have a history of trying to find solution to this big crisis, the Contadora Group back in the 80s, and there are some experiences of that. They should take the lead, and it's important that the US understands that and takes the lead of the decision of the Lima Group.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the question. I have done some research on finding new methods to try to provide humanitarian aid in Venezuela. Very interestingly, the use of new technologies, specifically the use of cryptocurrency, is already playing a role in Venezuela. We brought groups from the ground in Venezuela that are receiving donations through cryptocurrency, and they're using those donations to buy food and medicine and distribute it within Venezuela. This is increasingly happening because Venezuela has a hyperinflation, and the donations to get into the country is really limited, really repressive, right? So that's where the use of cryptocurrency is shedding a light of how we can use that as a method to get aid in a way that we probably haven't seen before. So I think looking into those, and the benefits are countless. I mean, it's transparent, it's censorship resistant, it's borderless, and it's empowering the people to use their own resources, right? Because it's direct. So I will look at that as a way to, because again, we need to think out of the box here. And I think that's one of those tools that can maybe help.
Thank you. My time is up. Congressman Guest.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rendon, would you agree that the Maduro regime is a corrupt regime? I think you mentioned that in your report or your transcript on page 2. Would you agree with that?
I'm sorry, what's that? Would you repeat that, please?
Would you agree that the current regime is a corrupt regime, being involved, I believe you say, in illicit activities, including drug trafficking, massive corruption, and money laundering?
Yes, correct.
And would each of you also agree with that as well, with that assessment of the current regime? And to each of you, would you agree that the current regime is an illegitimate regime based upon the sham elections that were held earlier last year?
Correct.
And would you also agree that the current regime has created both a political crisis and a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela?
Correct.
All right, so with that, what can be done to, short of military intervention, what can be done to remove Maduro from currently presiding over the people of Venezuela? I believe, Mr. Rendon, you talked in one of your statements that we must increase pressure on his inner circle. What methods could we use that we're currently not to increase pressure on his inner circle to have him step down?
Yes, and thank you for the question. So there are many tools that we have not yet accomplished yet. One of those, for example, is to work with other countries like Cuba, China, Iran, Russia, to make sure that they do not support Maduro. Because
all right, let me ask you, I hate to interrupt you, but would you agree that that is highly unlikely that we're going to convince China and Russia and Cuba not to support this regime?
Yes, it's going to be a difficult task.
Okay,
sure.
all right, I'll go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but just wanted to make sure.
No, that's a fair question. And secondly, I think now that we have a new recognized government led by Juan Guaido, we should be supporting him, trying to get his government get off the ground as quick as possible. How? Making sure to freeze those bank accounts, those assets that Maduro still controls today, not only within the U.S. jurisdiction, but also under those countries who recognize Guaido as the president. And also transfer those bank accounts to Guaido and the National Assembly. That's a very key point that I don't think we're there yet. And I think that's an important task to empower the legitimate government and trying to find a resolution, right? So I will add that, but I'm gonna,
Thank you for your question. I would start by saying that your question assumes that military intervention is the solution.
No, I said in light of that, what can we do?
Okay.
Because I think no one wants United States military to go into Venezuela and forcibly remove Mr. Maduro. And so what can we do short of that to accomplish that purpose? Because I believe once he's removed, then we're going to see humanitarian aid begin to flow into Venezuela. I believe he is the roadblock controlling the military that is creating this crisis. And we all want to see him removed, but no one wants to use any military force. So that is the question. What are we not currently doing that would promote regime change in Venezuela?
Right. I don't think that anybody has the magic solution and the great answer to that question. But there is one thing that is different now than before. For the last 20 years, and I've been following Venezuela as Executive Secretary of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights for 15 years. This situation has been going on and on and on for easily 15 years, and the international community, particularly Latin American community, did not pay attention to it. There are several reports of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights and most NGOs on human rights denouncing grave violations of human rights in Venezuela, at least since 2005. And the Latin American countries did not pay attention to it. for whatever reason. Right now, for the first time, that is happening. So there is a big difference between now, the Lima Group, the political negotiations that are going on, to everything else that was tried before. So there is a need to give time, to give chance to the political negotiations, to give chance to diplomacy, to give chance to the UN. This is the time to do it. What is going on right now, it just started, while all the failures are from the last 20 years. So we need to give a chance to this situation right now.
Well, and in addition to what we're currently doing, is there any additional pressure that we can put on that regime? And again, you talk about freezing assets and about putting pressure on his inner circle. And what I was wanting from each of you, what can we do as a government to make sure that we are putting as much political pressure on Maduro to resign as possible?
This might sound, I'm not a U.S. citizen. I'm from Argentina, and it might sound a little bit getting involved into something that is not my affair. But, I lived in this country for 30 years. And the U.S. should be, that's why I used that word before, following what the Lima Group decides, rather than pushing the Lima Group to do something. That negotiation is taking place, and when the U.S. makes a decision, it's pretty, it's the U.S. government, so that's pretty heavy. But it's important to let the Latin American countries that now, for the first time in 20 years, are doing something. It's important to support them and to follow up on their decisions.
Congressman Vargas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again for the witnesses for being here today. When I always thought of Venezuela, I always thought of it as a very stable democracy, just like Mexico, Colombia, a number of the large Latin American countries. And it really is tragic and almost unbelievable what has happened to Venezuela. And now we have, as Escobar, as you called it, a contested environment. I never would have expected that. Now, in the situation that we find ourselves, they find themselves in there, it's a humanitarian crisis that we seldom see in our hemisphere. And again, as being someone who's not in favor in any way of military intervention, I'm not in favor of that. But at the same time, we have to move this thing along because the suffering of the people there is so dramatic and not getting better. I mean, how can we help? I mean, we're attempting with humanitarian. I've listened to all your testimonies today, and humanitarian help first, and there's a whole bunch of other things. But is there anything else that we can do? And again, not using military force, because I'm not in favor of that. Is there anything else we can do without hurting the people? In other words, moving towards the transition, but without doing more damage to these poor people who have been hurt so badly?
I think to also add to this question and to what my fellow panelists have said, I think the strategy is twofold, right? And I think it's strengthening both of those strategies. I think it's widely accepted that the government uses oil to distribute rents to the officers and maintain itself in power. So the sanctions that are meant to limit his ability to do so can be strengthened. We can work with the international community so that all of Latin America and the European Union enforces these sanctions fully. Use diplomatic avenues so that Maduro, if we are going to go for this short-term, very dramatic strategy, that Maduro does not have other options to sell its oil. And that includes diplomatic conversations with India and Turkey and others. And while it's true that Russia and China may not be our allies, at the end they want to get paid. And they are deciding right now whether Maduro is the right person to bet on. And I think that calculation is changing by the minute. And there are other stronger things and escalations that we can engage in short of military intervention.
But also short of hurting people. I mean, one of the things that I have great concern about is oftentimes when we have sanctions placed on countries, we try to target them to hit the culprits, but oftentimes it ends up hurting the people in general. I mean, we don't want to starve the people of Venezuela. I mean, that does concern me, yeah, because 95% of the exports is oil. Yeah. I mean, if we cut off oil and we can't get humanitarian aid, into the country, I mean, how are the people going to eat? I mean, how are they going to survive?
Yeah, exactly. And this is why when we think about a humanitarian aid, the effort should be massive and using all possible ways, including negotiating safety corridors and finding always, because exactly of the calculus that you are that you're describing.
But that's very hard in a contested environment. I mean, you're the one that mentioned that actually in your testimony. You said this is a contested environment. It's hard to do that. I mean, we saw what happened with a little bit of aid. I mean, literally the Maduro's thugs didn't allow most of the aid in. I mean, how do you negotiate it when they have armed thugs preventing the aid from coming in? Anyone else want to try that, Mr.
Yeah.
Cantor?
A very, very short answer, which I mentioned it before. Give it a try. It just started now. You know, what we tried for the last 20 years, you know, nothing happened.
Right.
But it was not this. This is the first time it's happening, and the Latin American countries are serious about it. So let's give it a try.
Okay, the last question I did want to ask is this. One of the things that I fear is, what if Maduro rolls the tanks? I mean, what if at the end of the day he decides that he's just going to go to try to put down these massive demonstrations with massive assault on the people? Then what do we do? Because, I mean, this is not unheard of. I mean, this has happened, of course. Dictators have done this throughout history. Don't be afraid of the question. Somebody answer it. Mr. Rendon, go ahead.
So far has not been the experience in Venezuela, and you know, I have followed it since 2000. I met Chavez, I met Maduro, I spoke with them for the last, you know, many occasions. That hasn't happened. Really very grave things have happened, but not that.
Well, let's pray that it doesn't happen. My time is over. Let's pray that it doesn't happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Congressman Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Catton, you have articulated some of what my concerns are. There's no question in my mind, and I, like you, have been down to Venezuela. I've been going down there for the last 20 years. Knew with Chavez when he was there, and Maduro was part of the National Assembly. My concern, though, is with the United States being in front of everything, as opposed to the Lima Group and other allies, but particularly the Lima Group who are in the region, who surrounds the borders. What's happening is, as opposed to some of these other countries or other NGOs or other ones who trying to get that humanitarian aid in, it seems as though it's a political fight to a degree where it's the United States that has taken the front of this, as opposed to back and supporting these other groups from behind in that regard, as opposed to making it look like, you know, it's and the threat of military aid, military intervention. And so the bolsterist talk that's taking place, that helps hinder helping the Venezuelan people who needs help. The focus should be on the help. And one thing that I have not heard, what we need to make sure is done in these conversations, is bringing forth elections, democratic, free and fair elections, so it doesn't just look like we're trying to put somebody in and topple a government. We're saying, and I agree, that the prior election of Nicolas Maduro was not free, was not fair, and so therefore he was not legitimately elected. But what we should be advocating for is for the legitimate elections, not just putting someone in. And that's what the Venezuelan people want, because they do believe in democracy. I've seen it. When I was over in Europe just, last week, our European allies, they believe it's an illegitimate government, but they don't want they want others. They want to make sure that there's others that are involved in this. And when I look at what's taking place at the border, it's just the United States trying to force them way in. And when I look at, I'm told from some, they, have questions with Elliot Abrams, just the imagery because of what our past history is. That's a problem. And then some of the rhetoric that's taking place here, where the Colombians and the Brazilians and others are, millions of people are running across, and these governments are welcoming them. And so they didn't ask whether this is part of it or not, but they do ask, Well, how does the United States get involved when you've got people who are suffering and hurting in Central America, and our country saying not accept them, put up a wall to stop them from coming here, send them back? Thank God Colombia and Brazil is not doing that. Thank God they're not doing that, because then what would happen to those people? And that gives us a problem from leading in front because of the problems that we have with other areas on the hemisphere. So would it not make sense, or am I just, crazy here, that we allow the Lima Group, we allow OAS, we allow and get the UN more involved, so it is another party, and we do all that we can to support those groups. So it's not us trying to be the big guys coming in, the whatever Maduro calls us now. Does that make any sense to you?
Yes, of course. I agree with you, and I do have in my presentation the calling for elections. The 5 minutes time didn't allow me to reach the end, but I do think that should be the way out. Although I'm not very optimistic about it, I have to recognize that. But it should be the natural way out and peaceful way. The U.S. has a critical role. There's no question about that. And it has a history of relationship with Latin America. We go up and downs along the decades, but it is a very important role the U.S. can play. But at this stage, I agree with you, and I insist, for the first time in many, many years, when the issue of Venezuela comes up, for the first time, the Latin American countries, most of them, are working together. It's critical for the U.S. to support that process. And let the Latin American countries, the OAS, the UN, I would include Mexico as well, and I would include Uruguay as well, to work with them to try to find a solution.
Ms. Escobar?
No, I agree, and I mentioned in my testimony that we should let the Grupo de Lima lead, but we need to support, and our capabilities are massive, both in our ability to help in aid and otherwise, but we should let the Grupo de Lima lead, and interim President Guaido in terms of the rhetoric and the carrots and sticks.
Thank you. Chairman's going to take my time.
Congressman Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses, and also thank you to my colleague, Mr. Meeks, who referenced elections. And I want to turn our attention a little bit prospectively to a post-transition, hopefully post-peaceful transition. And I'd like to hear from each of you relative to what specific conditions you believe the international community and this U.S. Congress should ensure are satisfied to ensure that Venezuela has free and open and fair elections after a transition. And also what time frame you think would be most appropriate thereafter.
Sorry, I answer first, but sure. I have to leave because I need to take a flight. I would say incredible international observers, which the last elections in Venezuela, at least the last two elections, you probably know better than I do, there were no credible international election observation. The OAS was not allowed to go. The most important NGOs doing election observations were not allowed to go. The European Union was not allowed to go. So you need election observations. The time frame is now, but you cannot call for a snap election because that's not helpful, but to have a reasonable time for all the political parties to be able to participate freely. So we're talking about months, basically.
Months, okay.
Yeah, just to briefly add on that, you also need to work the conditions on the ground. Maduro has been proved to be intimidating the Venezuelan people using food as a weapon. So when you're calling elections, you need international observers, but you also need to work the conditions on the ground by providing humanitarian aid and disempowering the regime by using this tool, this food program called CLAP, which is the main political tool that they have been used, that is linked to the national ID and to the way you vote and the way you are politically affiliated. So in a way, it's like the Chinese credit system, but with lower technology. So if we want to set up free and fair elections in the future, That club program needs to be one of the first things that needs to be out, and among many others, right? Because now I agree, elections are the first step, but you need to announce a new electoral system. The current electoral system right now is highly corrupt. So you need to have a new council as well. So.
And any thoughts on who is in a position to initiate such a new system?
The only institution, based on the Venezuelan constitution, is the National Assembly. Okay. They're the only ones who can announce elections at this point, and also a new electoral system that can set up free and fair elections.
Okay, thank you.
And
Escobar.
just to add to that, which I agree with, I think you need a minimum of stabilization and citizen security to hold elections. And the National Assembly has actually approved guidelines on the transition and thinks that this might take around a year.
Okay, a full year. All right, thank you. I yield the rest of my time.
Congressman Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to explore a little the question of amnesty and human rights violations. And, you know, I'll direct this to Ms. Escobar, but I'm curious to hear both of your thoughts. Reports indicate that under Maduro, Venezuelan military officials have committed grave human rights abuses. The UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has reported the use of, quote, excessive force to deter demonstrations, crush dissent, and instill fear, end quote. It's my understanding that the Venezuelan National Assembly has enacted legislation to provide amnesty to public officials, including security forces, that abandon the Maduro regime and support the transition, the transitional government. President Trump relayed a similar message himself last week during his speech at Florida International University in Miami. He delivered what he called a, quote, message for every official who is helping keep Maduro in place, end quote. And he said the following: "You can choose to accept President Guaido's generous offer of amnesty, to live your life in peace with your families and your countrymen. President Guaido does not seek retribution against you, and neither do we." There's a long history of impunity for human rights abusers in the Western Hemisphere and other parts of the world. And, you know, on the other hand, there have been some examples of truth commissions and efforts to hold people accountable, which in my view are necessary for the development of healthy democracies. So can you provide a little more detail on the kinds of human rights abuses that may have been perpetrated by Venezuelan military officials to start with?
Yes, I wish our colleague was here because he had a long list, and the list, I mean, from torture and imprisonment and I mean, the killings that we witnessed this weekend. I think that the amnesty law and the proposal by Guaido is powerful because it is part of the strategy of getting the military to defect. However, there will be there will be a determination on those who have committed crimes against humanity, and that amnesty law cannot protect those.
They can't protect those under Venezuelan law or under international law, you're saying?
I think either.
That's something that's in Venezuelan law, in the Constitution, in statute? Where is that? Or is that just an aspirational kind of statement?
Yes.
Sorry, go on. Go.
According to the Venezuelan Constitution, there cannot be any pardon on human rights violations. So when I think of this amnesty law, I think not on the top generals who are the responsibles of committing human rights violations, and thinking more of the bottom soldiers who are just following orders from their generals, right? And that's where the strategy can be found. Now, there's a tricky part here, because when it comes to crimes against humanity, following orders is not an excuse.
Exactly. I mean, if you're my commander and you tell me to torture Mr. Phillips, I may not torture Mr. Phillips, and if I do so, I'm committing a grave human rights violation. So I don't understand the point about generals and soldiers on the ground.
That's correct. They are soldiers who have either not committed crimes against humanity and who can be saved by this amnesty law, and that's where I think this law can provide a bridge to some of those to support Guaido and the democracy of Venezuela. And I think it's a tool, together with the whole pressure that we're trying to use, to facilitate the democracy in Venezuela led by Venezuelans, right? So I think it's a powerful tool, and I think we need to support it as much as possible.
Well, thank you. I would just say that given the almost complete disregard for human rights of the current occupant of the White House in everywhere from South America to North Korea, this body has a responsibility to step up and proclaim America's long dedication to, and imperfect, but our dedication to human rights. And as urgent as the situation is in Venezuela, we need to proceed in a way that holds the respect for human rights sacrosanct. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Thank you, Congressman. We're going to have another round of questioning. I have it, and maybe they have another question. It was recently stated that India now has stepped up and bought the oil from Venezuela, and they did it pretty quickly. What can we do to stop that? Because that is basically the funding for Maduro.
Yes, I think that's a critical point, Mr. Chairman, and I think we need to engage the Indians. That cash is being used by Maduro to keep up the repressive regime, right? But that has a specific purpose too, that trade, and that's fueling the domestic gas in Venezuela. Venezuela is running out of gas, and people are not going to be able to fill their own cars with gas if the Indians are not sending that gas to Maduro. I think the more we empower, again, the Guaido's government, providing those oil payments to Guaido's government and the National Assembly, providing those trade agreements to Guaido's government and National Assembly, is not only the only constitutional legitimate way forward, but it's the right thing to do. And I think we need to, as much as possible, transfer those to Guaido. So when the U.S. talked to India, that's the direction that we need to be engaging, recognizing Guaido and engaging the Guaido's government.
Can the Lima Group talk to India?
That's a good question. I think they are on the authority to do it, and they should be pursuing that route.
They probably can, but we probably hold more leverage. And I think for India, it is completely an economic decision. If we think about the numbers, last year, PDVSA sold around $20 billion, but most of the cash came from the U.S. Now that the U.S. is not going to be providing that, they're going to be selling it at a deep discount. But just to think about the magnitude of the need, I think there still would be around $5 billion that would not reach the Maduro government. And I think that number is also important when we think about our humanitarian package.
Thank you. Congressman Levin, do you have a second question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to follow up, actually, on the PDVSA sanctions situation. And I'd like to get your all's take on the possibility of unintended consequences. As you know, the Trump administration put sanctions on PDVSA, presumably in hopes of that cutting off Maduro's money supply would force him to exit. But as I said during our last hearing on this subject, I'm worried about what's going to happen to the Venezuelan people while this strategy plays out or doesn't. The New York Times ran a story earlier this month on this very question, and I think the headline said it all. U.S. sanctions are aimed at Venezuela's oil. Its citizens may suffer first. So my question is, could these particular sanctions worsen the humanitarian crisis that has already gotten so bad in Venezuela? And I'm interested in either of your answer on this.
Yeah, I think the strategy is that one, is one, to be able to starve Maduro of his ability to continue to maintain himself in power. And that cannot happen without an equally robust strategy on the humanitarian side. And these are the orders of magnitude that we should be talking about.
Yeah, in a way, it's going to limit Maduro to keep importing food and other products. It's the only way the Venezuelan people are getting fed, by imports. So Maduro is no longer going to be able to import as much as before.
So we're sort of playing a game of chicken with him, where at the risk of the people starving.
I think the key part here, again, to the point of Guaido's government, is to make sure that he has the power to keep, and the National Assembly to import now. And if we're now recognizing Guaido as the only legitimate president, we need to give him that power. And I think providing humanitarian aid is a first step. We should be trying to keep pushing humanitarian aid, not only through the Colombian border, but through every single border in the country. And we only try once. Let's keep trying, because, again, the Venezuelans are starving. So I think that should be the...
Do you think it's fair to say that we've politicized humanitarian aid in this situation? That the U.S. is saying, well, this is the government over here, and and given the long history of the Yankee intervention in the hemisphere in many countries, overthrowing democratic governments, that it's problematic for us to be playing the role, even if it would be a good strategy in other circumstances.
I will argue, because of the National Assembly and President Guaido himself requested aid, and also this was a multilateral approach. It's not all about the U.S. sending aid. It's about Canada, Colombia, Argentina, Chile, Peru, Ecuador, and even Uruguay sending medical supplies, the European Union, following the National Assembly and Guaido's request for aid. And on top of that, the one politicizing, using food as a weapon here is Maduro, and he has been doing this for years. So when I see Saturday's event, I don't think aid being politicized. I think it's following, again, the only constitutional route that we have today to support the Venezuelan people, and I think we should be continuing that path. Yes, there is room for improvement. I think the execution of Saturday's humanitarian aid can be improved in many ways. We only saw that happening in 3 points of crossing points in that border. That is a border that has 250 unofficial crossing points. So if we want
unofficial or if it
unofficial, called trochas, which are irregular path where people, which by the way, 50% of the people crossing the border are using those unofficial paths. So if we want to really send humanitarian aid, we need to find those ways, and we need to keep continuing that pursuit, following the National Assembly request and President Guaido's request.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I mean, Mr. Chairman, I don't say any of this to support, the Maduro regime one iota. I just worry about finding the most effective way forward, given our country's history, and whether us playing such a prominent role, and of course, threatening force is the most effective way. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman. Congressman Dean Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We spend a lot of time talking about what we should do, perhaps not enough time listening to what people want or need. I'd welcome both of your perspectives, to the extent that you can share them, about what both the National Assembly, members of the Assembly, specifically independent of aid, because when you're hungry and in need, it doesn't matter where it comes from. Independent of that, what would the National Assembly, if they were here, as many as possible in front of us, what would they want from us right now? And what would the people of Venezuela, those that remain in country, what would they be asking us for right now if we could listen to them?
I think the National Assembly has a clear priority right now, which is the same as President Guaido. Stopping usurpation, Maduro's usurpation of power is priority number one. Second, letting Guaidó set up.
Can I interrupt you? And how?
Yes. I think going back to the points we have discussed, humanitarian aid is one, but also supporting the amnesty law that the National Assembly passed. I'm sure they will be asking the U.S. to support that amnesty law in ways that can be legal, right? I'm not supporting a violation against international law and human rights, but there's room to support this law that is kind of the only bridge that many military members have to get out of their situation, right? So that would be another. I think at the end, the day after scenario is a crucial issue that the National Assembly has been trying to put effort and energy on it. I think that will be another request. They will be asking the U.S. and the international community to keep in mind that the day after, they're going to be, the role of the U.S. and the international community is going to be crucial. From the economic, financial, security, social, institutional point of view, everything needs to be done in Venezuela. It's going to be a blank sheet. It's a completely destroyed country. And the only institution able, legitimate, to pursue that route is the National Assembly, but they can't do it alone. They need the support of the U.S. and other countries. So that would be, I'm sure, another request that they will be asking if they were here, and among many other priorities, right? But and going back to the bank accounts and the assets, and they need to operate as a government. They cannot do it right now because Maduro is limiting them financially and economically. So they will be probably asking the U.S., hey, we need access to bank accounts and to assets so we can operate as a government.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Escobar.
I mean, I think to just reiterate, the situation is unbearable on the ground for most Venezuelans. And I think we have shared a lot of numbers, but these numbers don't reveal the sense of powerlessness of not having a voice to democratically choose another path. And I think is an incredible momentum around the world. And I think Venezuelans want to know that we have their back and that we will not forget and push as hard as we can as they see an opening right now.
So it's fair to say that the people of Venezuela want us to play a role in both promoting a transition and, of course, very importantly, rebuilding the nation. And my question was more to the sentiment right now of the Venezuelan people vis-a-vis the United States of America and what role they want us to play.
Absolutely, and this is why I think they continue to go to the streets, even though this, again, this is a country that's been battered in so many ways.
Okay, thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you. I thank the witnesses and all members for being here today. With that, the committee is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.